radically rethinking railways in Australia with your regular tour guide and host, the Mad Professor, up to our 26th episode, and today we're not in Australia, but in Japan. You might think we are not sticking to our brief of focusing on rethinking Australian rail, but here in Japan is the best place to reflect on Australian railways and why they need a rethink, and have a nice warm dip in a hot spring. We have combated those false narratives and misleading views about our railways that many foreigners would find ludicrous if we subjected them to such nonsense, yet we believe such stuff ourselves. We spent much of the last episode, when the war is over, looking at railways during World War II, and asked ourselves why rail authorities spread the lie that our railways were disadvantaged by the war. If they want to see true disadvantage, they could have transposed themselves to the land of our northern enemies. We are here in Tokyo during the air raids of early 1945. You might think the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the worst thing to happen to Japan, but they are relatively small cities. Far more people died in Tokyo, especially on March the 10th, 1945. If you want a good introduction to the Tokyo air raids, the late Tony Barrell, who was an ABC radio announcer, made an excellent program called Higher Than Heaven, and links to this have been placed below. Other major cities like Osaka and Nagoya were flattened by conventional bombing, while interestingly Kyoto, the ancient capital, was not bombed. Neither was Kanazawa on the north coast, though some speculate that they, like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were being saved for nuking. It goes without saying the major rail networks were utterly ruined by aerial bombardment, and that is without thinking of every other problem, like lack of staff, lack of maintenance they also experienced, infinitely worse than Australia did. But we are not here to elicit sympathy for Japan. As they say, they started it, and the cruelty they inflicted across China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and even on our Northern Railway in Darwin and elsewhere, drains away our capacity to care what happened to them. But let's not pretend Australia had it bad. Japan, of course, rebuilt its railways quickly, while Australia did all the wrong things, made excuses, commissioned stupid reports from British experts, who recommended all the wrong things. We bought the wrong equipment and failed to do the things the war taught us we needed to do, like standardise all our main railways as quickly as possible, fix up all the kinks and bottlenecks in our railways, and build our lines heavy and strong. This episode will look at what Japan did right, what we did wrong, and how much mythology our rail commentators believe. Before we get into destroying myths about Australia's railways, let's destroy a few about Japan and its railways. While Japan's population is close to 5 times that of Australia, in a landmass resembling New Zealand in size and shape, this is not going to be a good argument for saying there is no comparison. The vast majority of Japan's population live in the metropole of 4 main islands, and the vast majority of that is on the main island Honshu. Kyushu in the south is 12 million, and Hokkaido, which we are seeing here, is around 5 million, and most of those in the single capital city of Sapporo. The island is slightly larger than Tasmania, and Shikoku is the smallest main island, and also has the smallest population, at around 3 million, spread across a few cities. Again, these produce average densities higher than Australia, but not orders of magnitude so. And as we examined in our episode 5, density is a poor guide generally to rail planning, if we can even define what we mean. And Japan will definitely confound our thinking, as we will see today. Another myth about Japan is that it has huge amounts of investment in new space-age trains. Now that is not exactly untrue, as you will see lots of newish trains, and some that seem very advanced by Australian standards. Some like this one, with unusual bodywork, which our treasuries would strip out of any proposal. Often in Japan, a train intended for a particular tourist line might be styled in a fancy way, like this one on the Eizan network in Kyoto. But your typical train, whether in the city underground, the suburbs, or the countryside might be old, very old. Nonetheless, it will be well maintained and kept, and may be very comfortably furnished, which, if nothing else, might offset the feeling of being old. Another myth about Japanese railways is about the widespread use of the Cape gauge, which we noted in our episode Off the Gauge is a reference to its supposed South African origin. But in reality, it really could be called Japanese gauge, given its extensive use here. But even that hides the true gauge situation, as in truth, much of the Japanese rail network is standard gauge. The perception of Japanese railways being Cape gauge is not wrong. The largest operator, JR, makes the most extensive use of this gauge, as do some private lines. But the underground and commuter operations of the private or city companies are most often standard gauge, and JR2 uses a huge network of standard gauge lines, both for high-speed operation of the Shinkansen and for places like Yamagata and Akita, where it runs those trains onto the conventional rail network. And as we see here, because the Yamagata line has been converted to standard gauge, a fleet of local standard gauge electric cars also works the line. In our episode Off the Gauge, we looked at whether gauge really matters and what gauge Australia should use. Looking at Australian experience, we actually suggested Cape gauge might have been the best, as it delivers most of the heavy passenger and freight haulage, plus speed, that Australia required, even up to 200 kilometres an hour, as this Queensland Railways tilt train has demonstrated, running at 215 kilometres as part of a test. Of course, standard gauge does handle faster trains, but only when you're proposing Shinkansen level speeds. In the late 1950s, when this idea first gained speed, standard gauge was chosen, now common. But of course, it meant JR's predecessor, the Japan National Railways, having to think through the problems of having a mixed gauge network. Like the Swiss, who we looked at in that episode, there really isn't a problem with gauge in Japan. People change trains where they need to, and if that really isn't commercially or politically feasible, like in Yamagata, they do the conversion. End of story. It is not that Australia is sabotaged by the gauge issue, just that our politicians and bureaucrats refuse to manage the issue well. For example, all of Victoria's country lines could have been converted to standard gauge, leaving only the Metropolitan Passenger Network broad gauge, much like in South Australia. And what effect would it have had? Really nothing. No different from analogous situations in Japan. A city like Kobe has its standard gauge underground, while largely surrounded with narrow gauge country lines. You just need to change trains. In episode 9, we looked at mainline electrification in Australia, and the lesson is similar. New South Wales and Victoria could be said to have made a big mistake with low voltage DC electrification after the Second World War, but really it didn't matter. It cost too much, but Japan, like much of Europe, also had substantial low voltage DC wiring, and they made it work. The large part of the conventional main line from Tokyo to Osaka, the Hokkaido main line, was wired at the same voltage of 1500 volts as in New South Wales and Victoria, though not long after that the Shinkansen was also built with high voltage AC wiring. If it required a technical solution, the Japanese devised it. If, as is also common, it just required operational changes, like passengers having to change trains, then they did that too. Only in Australia does this stuff cause heartburn. And while Australia never proceeded with all the massive line electrifications we actually planned for, from Kalgoorlie to Bunbury, Brisbane to Townsville, and Sydney to Melbourne, Japan did electrify most of its network, and a sensible decision that was. We might have complained about the lack of oil in 1973 in Australia with the Yom Kippur War, yet Japan was genuinely frightened by lack of energy security. And like the French, thought the combination of nuclear power, coal imports from places like Australia, and widespread electrification would reduce the worries 2/3 of Japan's railways are now electrified, and the balance are almost all only minor branches. Japan's network is largely private. Though this is not ideological in the main, and provides good lessons to Australians. Unlike the failed British privatisation we saw in our episode 22, Private Property, the government sold the Japan National Railways to several semi-private corporations as a way of reducing its own debt, including pension liabilities. Much of the rest of the rail network already belonged to private companies. These companies were mostly urban rail operators, running commuter trains into the centre of large cities. We see some successful ones here, like the Honshu in Kintetsu, with its long-distance line from Nagoya to Osaka, with a luxury long-distance train running on what is essentially one long suburban commuter line. Highly recommended, and much cheaper than the Shinkansen on the same route, though obviously slower. These companies very early in Japan's rail history integrated themselves into non-rail industries, which were complementary to their rail role. This included property development and retailing. The Kintetsu Railway is one of a few who own a department store chain, in this case also called Kintetsu. One of these companies is even known in Australia, with the Tokyu Corporation owning large swathes of Perth's northern suburbs. Being a railway company in Japan, they did not stand in the way of the recent expansion of the Yanchep line, and have worked with government on these extensions. And though the Japanese Sekisui Building Company is not a rail operator in Japan, they too have cooperated with the Queensland Government on the likely extension of the railway from Springfield to Ipswich via Ripley. Foreigners are often astounded to see a commuter railway line emerge from the ground and stop 3 floors up in a shopping centre. But this is why. Delivering those commuters to your retail premises and developing the land around the railways as much as the government will allow. This is very different from Australia's rail history, where government railways squatted on land they didn't need for many decades without developing it. When we looked at privatisation in episode 22, we saw that really public and private ownership are not really the defining feature, but what you use the best of public and private ownership for. Your mad professor has come down on the idea that railways under development, for example, major construction projects, ones penetrating areas of future rather than present urban growth, these lines should definitely be public to access the cheapest finance and manage the major risks to the economy and society. However, once a line is mature, stable, and with a defined revenue path, it can be privatised. And in the words of the last Liberal federal government of Tony Abbott, the asset could be recycled, that is, the private purchase proceeds spent on the next public project. Much as your mad professor detests Liberal governments, this neoliberal idea is not a bad one. We saw it in play on the Sydney Metro to Tallawong. Other public assets, in the form of the electricity network, were sold to pay for it. It was built by government, but it is now fully built, and its revenue stream is somewhat predictable. It is fit for a private company to quietly manage. In Japan, it has played out through the privatisation of the massive Japan National Railways in 1987, with separate companies managing JR in Hokkaido, Shikoku and Kyushu, and 3 main companies in Honshu, East, West and Hokkaido, which has the custody of the main Tokyo-Osaka Shinkansen. When the Shinkansen network was expanded, for example, parallel to the old railway from Morioka to Aomori in the northeast, the old railway was given the form of privatisation and separation from the JR conglomerate. It is what the Japanese call a third sector railway, basically a mix of private and local government capital. It retains some competition between the JR Shinkansen and the old line, but also ensures the local prefectural government is invested in keeping the old line serving those small communities which JR no longer sees the need to serve. There are several of these third sector railways up and down Japan, not just parallel to Shinkansen routes, but also ones like this one, to the difficult to pronounce tourist town of Amano Hashidate. It It is now owned by the Willa Corporation, who run tourist trains, but also a subsidised local service. And finally, that company has non-rail interests in hotels and other related industries, in the same way the urban private railways do. So the public-private question does not become an institutional friction point in rail politics in Japan the way it does in Australia, and shows we could manage it better, potentially handing off our vanilla urban rail operations to private or semi-private operators, inviting our large local governments to manage local railways, such as the ones we examined in our episode Back on Track, and finally, recycling government funds into rail development projects like the Perth Metronet, Sydney Metro, or even this channel's high-speed rail proposal we looked at in our episode It's High Time. The final myth is that Japan, besides its higher population and density, is also somehow topographically gifted in being ideal for rail transport, and would somehow lack road competition. Both are lies, apart from being literally spread across at least 4 main islands, each with huge undersea tunnels or bridges. Japan famously has a central mountain range running from north to south. The Japanese landform is such that past riverine erosion and volcanic eruptions have created vast plains for trains to easily run on, but that is really beside the point. Those plains have been reserved for rice growing, and Japan, mindful of its dependence on foreign resources to support its population, prioritises self-sufficiency in rice, even to the point of having rice grown on small suburban blocks in the centres of cities. And this is why, among other things, lines like the Shinkansen are built on viaducts or in tunnels. The massive mountain ranges are far bigger than anything in Australia, culminating in the peak of Mount Fuji, nearly 4 kilometres tall. The Hokkaido Shinkansen was built along the coastal plain, but on a fairly winding route, to avoid the mountains where it could, but knowing that it could not entirely avoid the mountains, pushed through them in literally hundreds of tunnels. Many of this channel's episodes talk about Australian rail administrators who are always pleading poverty. Yet, we saw in our episode 13, those were the days, my friends, that far more extensive rail works, like tunnels and tall bridges, were built by our colonial ancestors from a much smaller population and revenue base than we have today. Japan too, picking itself up from the destruction of World War II, built these tunnels and viaducts from a much smaller resource base after World War II. So what was our excuse? After the original Tokyo-Osaka line, a line was built down to Fukuoka in Kyushu with the same basic features. Then, across the central mountain range, not once, but twice, to the cities of Niigata and Kanazawa, and of course, to Japan's northeast, and under the sea to Hokkaido and the city of Hakodate. Eventually, it will reach the Hokkaido capital at Sapporo, though they are taking their time. And now, the main corridor from Tokyo to Osaka is full. They are building a maglev train even faster, with a design speed of 500 kilometers an hour between Tokyo and Nagoya, and eventually Osaka. We haven't even straightened up our basic lines, such as those to Newcastle or Wollongong, let alone started building any high-speed railway. And it is partly Japan's experience that has informed this channel's desire to have high-speed rail under the snowy mountains in Australia. It is a lie that we haven't, or can't, build massive tunnels in Australia. The Snowy Hydro Corporation built no less than 145 kilometres of tunnel under the snowy mountains after World War II, with only picks and shovels and a bit of explosive powder. The longest ones, linking Lake Yukonbene and the Snowy and Tumut rivers, are both over 20 kilometres long, and they are again building another 27 kilometres of tunnel for the Snowy Hydro 2 scheme. And this is not just for water. The Ski Tube Railway also built 8 kilometres of tunnel in the 1980s for their trains, the longest rail tunnel at the time. So we are more than capable of delivering Japanese-scale railways through tunnels or high viaducts. And those critics who want one more way of trying to excuse Australia's poor performance talk about the role of motor vehicles. In our episode 8, Who Blamed Roger Rabbit, we looked at the idea of a road lobby which has become a whipping boy for rail's poor performance. In truth, it was the rail bureaucrats themselves who did this, not the motor vehicles. Some of these people Point to an imagined Japan where people don't drive. Yes, a Japan where Toyota, Mitsubishi, Nissan, Subaru, Isuzu and others have their home. Apparently, the Japanese don't have cars. In truth, most Japanese families have a car, though probably not 2 or 3 cars like in Australia. In outer suburban and rural areas, people really depend on their cars for many local trips, even with good local bus networks. Sadly, even in Japan, railways close. This line to Mikawa in Hokkaido passes through a depressed and declining industrial area, and much of the line was destroyed in a storm. What is left, which is run by this small rail motor, built decades ago, is likely to close in 2024. Sad, but pragmatic. Hopefully the local council might see the benefit of taking it on themselves and improving it if they can. And Japan has freeways, nearly 10,000 kilometres of them. Like the Shinkansen, they are blasted through mountains and over high valleys. The key difference is a Japanese person is unlikely to drive long distances on the freeway, unlike in Australia, simply because they have a better option with the Shinkansen. And because the government charges tolls, and depending on where they are, these can be very expensive. But if you do insist on driving, you can drive a long way across Japan and spend far more doing so than catching the train to where you are going. It's not that Australians want to drive, they are forced to, because the government provides no other options. And there is no reason for a road lobby to have any more success in Japan than rail, if only because those massive corporations, like Mitsubishi, are just as likely to be making money from rail and road. And that gets us on to Japan's legendary industry policy. There isn't an Australian economics student who hasn't had to listen to lectures on Japan's post-war industrial policy, its so-called infant industries, its national champions, and the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MITI. MITI was so famous in Japanese post-war development, there is even a special character in the Japanese language character set we call katakana, and that contains the sound T, as in MITI, which is otherwise not used in the normal Japanese language. Japan took the view after World War II that it needed to rebuild its economy with massive barriers to trade for industrial and consumer imports, while simultaneously promoting exporting companies to push Japanese consumer and industrial goods around the world, and gearing its education system to produce vast numbers of students in engineering and like endeavours. This strategy was successful and saw Japan's growth from 1945 to around 1988 skyrocket. It kept people in jobs and helped Japan to afford a consumer society with colour televisions and high-speed trains. It meant that Japan could also push its rail products around the world, such that Australian rail suppliers eventually got used to names like Hitachi and Mitsubishi for rail equipment, long before those names became household consumer product brands. Meanwhile in Australia, we allowed the British to push their garbage rail equipment on us, such as this Walkers of Wigan disgrace we saw in our episode 3, Accidental Death of a Railway. Walkers literally mounted this bus body on rails to solve a particular problem in Ireland. In that country, local rail services were to be discontinued, but legislation in both the Republic and the North would need to be instituted to do so. So a rail motor with a design life of only 8 years was delivered, long enough to pass the legislation and then sign the replacement bus contracts. Of course, we got our walkers to last at least 30 years, but they were still rubbish. Now, of course, we could have adopted the Japanese stance, with meaningful local protection of rail equipment suppliers, with barriers to American or British goods, and pushing our products overseas as well, and supported by an education system that could have turned out vast numbers of engineers and technical officers. Or instead, we could have just imported Japanese stuff, or Swedish, or German, or whatever. All these options would have been better than what we did. Despite the higher population, you can learn so much from Japan about how Australian rail could have been better. if we had electrified and straightened out our network, privatised where we could, but kept government as the developer of rail systems, kept our old trains, maybe like our Melbourne Comenge trains or Brisbane Emu sets, going as long as we could, and thus saved our money, put tolls on our freeways, and finally supported our own producers, or if not that, then just kept open our purchasing to whoever was selling good and cheap, like the Japanese. And if we'd done all these things, we could have had a network we'd be proud of. Next time, in Radically Rethinking Railways, we come back to Australia and look at the potential for street railways, also called trams or light railways, and how we might look at the needs of our smaller cities in Light and Easy. See you then.